Hi there guys, welcome back into my studio. My name's Connor and I am a wildlife artist that specialises in both Scratchboard and graphite. So I wanted to welcome you into the first of this 3-part series on how to create a red panda in Scratchboard. So this series is aimed at both beginners and intermediates, but if you are a beginner, this one is going to push your skills a little bit further and probably challenge you a little bit more. So the series is going to be split over 3 parts, and in this first part we're going to look at how to create the eyes, the nose and this muzzle texture, and then in part 2 we're going to look at the ears and the rest of the head, and then finally in part 3 we're going to look at the legs and the rest of this body texture. So I hope you guys enjoy this one, and let's get started. Right then guys, so to start with, I've zoomed right in on this guy's face so we can get a really close-up view of where we're working. So I'm going to start on these 2 very small eyes. Now I'm going to try and show you and sort of describe my process throughout this whole piece as we go along. So I'm going to try and show you what I'm thinking about in different areas, just to give you a bit of an overview of how I do things. Now, even though this whole piece is an 8 by 10, the eyes on this one are incredibly small. So if I just put my finger up, that's sort of the size of it compared to my finger. So they are quite small. Now, because of this, for a bigger eye, I would probably normally use my fiberglass brush, so something like this, to get in those details, but because of the size of this one, I'm actually going in with one of my tattoo needles. Now at the beginning, I've just gone through the various tools that we're going to be using throughout this piece. So tattoo needles are going to be very important. We're going to use them quite a lot. Now I have adjusted the exposure on this video, just so that you can see the outlines of what I've done, because I use carbon paper to transfer my line art onto my boards, but it has pros and cons. So the pro being, if I was using something like white transfer paper, it would show up quite a lot, and it's quite difficult to make those lines disappear. Whereas with this sort of black carbon paper, it's a lot darker, so you can hide these outlines a lot easier. But the downside of that is it's quite hard to see at times, so you do have to have some really good lighting. So I hope you guys can see the line art that I've actually put on the page. So at the minute, I'm just going around the edge of this eye, and I'm just trying to outline where different structures are. So I've got the pupil in the middle that I'm just going around the edge of, and then I've got this highlight that's going to sit above this eye. So at the minute, I'm being really delicate with the marks that I'm making, and the tattoo needle that I'm using here is a 9RL tattoo needle. Now, if you're not sure what these tattoo needles can do, then I do have another video sort of explaining the different tools that I use, and I'll link that in the description below. But at the minute, I'm just doing these very, very short little dabs. Now the tattoo needles that I'm using here, I actually used on another recent piece. So they're not brand new, so they're not as sharp as they would be straight out of the packet. But that's okay, they're still working fine. But I may have to, about halfway through this piece, I may have to open up a new one if we start to use it more. So as you can see already, we've just got a few little marks in there. And like I say, at the minute, we're just outlining. We're not worrying too much about anything else. We're just sort of trying to get in some structure. Now, I'm constantly looking at my reference photo. So I've got 2 reference photos, on the go at the minute. So one is my actual reference photo, the actual picture of this red panda. And the other reference photo is my line art that's been sort of superimposed onto the top of the reference photo. And what this does is it allows me to see where I've put certain marks. So this line that's coming down here and around underneath this eye, this area that we're working on just here, I can see on my reference photo that that's the lower eyelid. So I know where I'm working. And again, I'm just putting in some light dots. These are very, very light pressured. I'm not pressing hard. But I am also looking at the edges. So this edge that's sort of closest to the eye itself, this part just here, it's quite a hard edge. So if you compare that to, let's say, this area down here, this is going to be more of a soft edge. So what I'm doing is I'm putting in sort of more dots along that area, and then as we work out to the edge, I'm just spacing those dots out slightly. And that's just going to give it a bit of a softer appearance. So we're still on these initial base layers. These aren't, like I say, any sort of detail just yet. We're just trying to get that structure in. So the reason I sort of start on the eyes to begin with is because I find that in most pictures, not all, but in most of them, you will have the two sort of furthest ends of the spectrum with regards to tone. So because we work in Scratchboard, we have to be careful because we're limited on the darkness we can get and also on the brightness we can get, with the darkest dark being the black of the board and the brightest white being the clay underneath. So if we judge these wrong, it can lead to our values being off. But when we're starting with the eye, normally the black pupil is going to be one of the darkest parts, like I say, for most pieces. There are exceptions, but as a general rule, that's going to be one of your darkest areas. And then the same goes for the highlight that's sitting just above here. This is going to be one of the brightest areas. Now this all sort of goes back to when you've looked at your reference photo to begin with and determined where those darkest values are. So if anyone's been following my work for some time, you'll notice that before I start a piece, I'll always really examine the reference photo and try and determine any areas of potential difficulty, potential challenges that we may face, but I'll also look at the brightest and the darkest values. And that's all part of that planning stage. Now to get these highlights just here to just be a little bit brighter, all I'm doing is, you can do it a few different ways. You can either go in again with another layer, or you can press a little bit harder. Now both are going to give you a fairly similar level of brightness. However, you want to try and build up these tones slowly because that's what's going to help with that realism. So I would normally suggest go over it again, and if you want to vary your pressure ever so slightly, that's fine. but don't go too hard. And I'm not going to add much more detail than what I've got in at the minute, just for now, because I want to get a few other areas in first, because this is a very, very small part to work on. And once you've worked on it for some time, you need just to move on a little bit. So that gives you the sort of general impression of what we're going to be sort of aiming for. Now, like I say, we'll have to re-go in on some of these areas actually. I might just do it now. And when you really look at your reference photo, this outer edge is just a little bit brighter. Not massively, but just a little bit brighter than this sort of shadow area over here. And we can always readjust these. We can come back in and make things a bit brighter. But I think for now, we'll leave that just as it is. And we'll start moving on to the other eye. Now, when I'm working on eyes that are this small, I'll normally work on both at the same time. And that's just because there's a certain technique for when you're working on such a small area. And I don't want to forget what I'm doing or the different pressures that I'm using. So again, this area is quite small. That pupil is incredibly small. So I'm just going to very, very carefully just outline it with my tattoo needle. And you can make your picture for you however big you like. If you struggle doing eyes this small, then you can work on something a lot bigger. So you could go up to 9 by 12, 11 by 14. I probably wouldn't recommend going, if you are sort of just starting out in Scratchboard, I probably wouldn't recommend going much smaller than this, because they can be quite tricky to get. Sometimes people will think the smaller the eyes, the easier they'll be, just because you don't have to put in as much detail. But it's actually probably a little bit contrary to that, because when you're working on a bigger eye, you have a little bit more freedom, a little bit more forgot what the word would be, probably the words completely escape me, a bit more you don't have to worry too much about getting something completely in the wrong place. So for example, if we were very, very slightly off by, let's say, 0.5 millimeter with this pupil on a bigger piece, it wouldn't be as noticeable. But if you are 1 millimeter off or 0.5 millimeter off on a piece of this size, then that's going to be really noticeable. It's going to be more dramatic in regards to the scale. I might have to just swap to my craft knife just to get these brighter highlights in, because it's proving a little bit more tricky on this eye. And you've got a couple of different methods on how to actually create these eyes. For something this small, I would generally recommend to use a stippling technique, which is what we're using here. And that's just loads and loads of very, very small, tiny dots. Now it's a slower process, definitely, but I feel like it gives you more control over your mark making compared to, let's say, something like cross hatching, especially for an area of this size. But if you prefer cross hatching, then that's absolutely fine. If you feel like you can cross hatch in this sort of size of an area and it works for you, then that's absolutely fine. They will both give a good texture, but I just find if you're a beginner especially, stippling's probably going to be a little bit easier for you to do. Probably going to leave them just as they are. Now this left eye looks a lot brighter than the right eye. Now in reality on my board they're not. I think it's just the exposure that I've got and my lighting. So they're not actually that bright. Just darken a bit. So now we've got both shapes in, we're going to start working on the fur surrounding these eyes. So we're going to start mainly around this eye instead of the other eye, just because the detail's a lot more noticeable on this area. So we've got a couple of different tools that we can use for this. We've got our tattoo needles and we've also got our craft knife. Now everything that I'm telling you in these videos, they can all be achieved with a craft knife. You don't have to have the tattoo needles to do this technique. However, I just find that the tattoo needles give me a lot more freedom and a lot more control over the different marks that I'm making. It allows me to sort of keep the brightness low and a little bit more delicate. So the one that I'm going to use to begin with is going to be the 5RL tattoo needle. And this is one that I use pretty much for every single piece that I do. And again, this isn't a new one. I've used this on my last piece, so it might be a little bit blunter. So if you're using a brand new one, just be careful that straight out of the box it will be a little bit sharp. So they're the sort of marks that you'll get with this tattoo needle. Now this one is a lot finer. This is the 1RL tattoo needle. So this one will just give you a very, very sharp, fine point, which is really good for small details such as this. Now, because I've sort of upped the contrast, you can see the lines that I've put in for my line art. Now these are all showing you the different directions that you can go with this fur, so it's helping me so that I don't get confused. And we're just going to slowly build up this fur texture. What I might actually do, I might try and get you a little bit closer just so that you can see this a little bit clearer. Right then, so what I've ended up doing is I've rotated my board as well, but I've just sort of zoomed in a little bit and sharpened up this area so you can see a little bit clearer what I'm doing. So I'm still using my 5M1 tattoo needle and I'm holding it on the side. So I'm not holding it face down like this and I'm not holding it face down like that. I'm just holding it on the side, if you can see. And I'm just doing some very fine light strokes. Now you always want to be paying attention to 3 different things when trying to create fur. So the first one that we've briefly gone over is fur direction. Now fur direction's very important, and I mention this all the time because I think it's where a few people struggle. So fur direction will help give your piece form. It will help sort of determine the shape, the structure of whatever it is you're doing, whether that be an animal, a pet, wildlife. So I get all of that, or I try and work that out at the very beginning when I'm first sort of planning a piece. So I don't want to sort of be shocked or surprised when I get into a piece and I'm a bit confused with where the fur is actually going. So I try and look at my reference photos at the very beginning and really try and work out where that fur is going. And when I'm then doing my line art, as you can see, just need to move my reference photo, you can see all these different lines going in a few different directions. Now that allows me to then see where I need to be going, and it helps just take off some of that pressure and that unknown. Now you still have to pay close attention because it's not going to tell me everything exactly, but it will give me a good idea so that I'm not having to try and work it out as much as if they weren't there. So you can see how these lines are curving round, so I already know that's where my fur needs to go. Now the second thing is fur length. So again, that's helped at the very beginning when I'm doing my line art, and you can see that these lines, as well as show me the direction that I'm going in, they're all different lengths. So you can see these lines are longer than, let's say, these lines up here, and that's just again to help me judge the length of the fur, because you don't want to be putting in fur that's really long on the bridge of this guy's nose, or fur that's really short sort of as we're coming up and around onto this head. And then the final thing that we need to look at is the tone, because we're working in black and white. It's getting the tone correct is crucial. And you can see where I've put this W in here. Again, that's just signifying to me that this is going to be a very white area of fur, or a very bright area of fur. And the B will stand for black if you see B's on the board. And again, we haven't changed our technique here. We're still just using this 5M1 tattoo needle. It is starting to feel a little bit blunt. I probably should have changed it to begin at the piece, but it's okay for these initial base layers. But when we're actually doing these strokes, we're not doing them perfectly straight. We are sort of crossing them over a little bit, if you can see, because I don't want this fur to look perfect. I want it to look a bit scruffy. I want it to look a little bit raggedy, if that makes sense. Now, as we get closer to the eye, I'm just changing to my 9RL tattoo needle. Now, I don't use this a lot for fur, but it's really good just to soften this edge as it sort of goes into the eye, or into that shadow above the eye. So you can really start to see this fur around this eye sort of coming together a little bit. And all of this is that first initial layer, maybe one or two sort of layers just above it. Now, also what I'm looking at when I'm doing the fur is how much shadow I can see between the fur itself. So, for example, when we're looking at this area of brightness, or this area around the eye, it looks fairly dense, so there's not a great deal of fur poking through. When, let's say, you compare it to this area over here. Now, that means that I'm going to be putting my more strokes down, so I'm not going to be leaving many gaps between the fur, and that's how we're going to make it look a bit more dense. If we don't, and we sort of leave a lot of gaps, like probably what we've got up here now, it's going to look a little bit wiry. It's probably not going to give us the result that we want. And you can see how much we're taking our time with this. We're not quickly trying to get these underlayers in. These base layers are the ones that are going to take us the most time, because they're acting as that foundation for the whole piece. We're not going to go in and get that final finished look of a piece straight away on that first layer. It's just not really going to happen. I might just try and adjust the exposure now that we've got some of these whites in, just because it's struggling. So hopefully you can see the lines still, but that's a little bit more like what I'm viewing at the minute on my board. So my camera's struggling just because it's now working with an area of brightness as well. So you can see here how we've got the fur that comes down, it then curves up and over this eye, and then it curves down, and this is where it's going to start joining up here. So by getting that fur direction in the right place, it's made it easier to sort of determine the form of this little red panda. So we're going to start now adding in a little bit more detail to this area. So I'm swapping now to my craft knife, Now you can use any craft knife, you don't have to use anything specific. You can just use a basic one from any sort of hobby store. And this is just going to add a little bit more detail. I'm not going to be putting in too much just yet. So when I do my pieces, I try and work on a small area at a time, but I never get that area up to 100% completion straight away, because as you work on one area, you'll add something in that will then make you want to readjust another area. So as we go a little bit brighter, you may realize that one area needs to go darker, or because you've made one area a bit brighter, you need to make another area brighter. So there's constantly going to be this adjustment throughout the whole piece. But I like to get an area roughly 70 to 80% complete before moving on. And you need to get these well, you can work on the area as a whole. Some people like to work across the whole piece at one time, and I've just never been able to do that, so I tend to work on smaller areas like this. And now, because we've got that, or added some more brightness in, it means that this highlight just needs brightening up a bit as well. And again, I'm not pressing hard when I'm doing these strokes. These are just, again, very, very light, because we're almost trying to keep we don't want to use up all the layers of the board really straight away. We just want to build up that variation in tone. So we do just need to be a bit careful. So I'm just going to rotate my board back. Yeah, just adjust that contrast a little bit, or that exposure. Now, some of these marks look a little bit harsh at the minute, so I just want to soften them down. So I'm just going to use my tattoo needle again and just do another layer over the top, and this is just going to help soften up that fur, because this fur above this eye is quite fluffy looking, so I don't want it to be too coarse. And this is just helping getting rid of some of those lines that are in between the whites that we've done. It's just helping to soften things a little bit. Okay. Just blowing off some of that excess dust. So it's going to look a little bit unusual till we start getting some of these other areas in, but we just have to try and trust the process. Sometimes easier said than done. So this area down here is going to be quite dark, but then obviously we've got this sort of more wiry fur going over the top. So I'm probably going to now just start working on this left side. So now that I've shown you how we would do the fur here, I'm going to speed up this area just a little bit, just so that you can just see what's going on instead of having me sort of voice it over and walk you through it, just because you've already seen how I would do it here. So I'm just going to speed this area up and you'll see it come to life a bit quicker. Right then guys, so now that we've got both of those sort of areas above the eyes and around the eyes in, we're now going to look at joining these two areas together and also just adding a little bit more detail around. So when you're looking at this reference photo, you can see there's almost this stripe of slightly lighter fur, and it's sort of either side of it is just a little bit more dark fur. Now it's a little bit more wiry than, let's say, these two areas. These two areas are quite dense looking. So we're going to start trying to get that sort of area in. Now you can see how on the reference photo the fur looks a lot wavier as well. So it's not as straight as these areas of fur. And that's what we're going to try and replicate as well. So I'm just trying out a few different options with tools, just to see which one gives me the best effect. It looks like it's going to be my 5M1 tattoo needle. So we're going to start just by bringing some of the fur out from this area of white. And you can see now how the fur strokes that I'm putting in are a lot wavier. They're a little bit more wild. Now we're not trying to get exactly every bit of fur in the same direction and the same place as we are in the reference photo. We're just going for that sort of general feel of this fur. I'm trying not to lose where this sort of central line is, because as I start putting in these details, that line's going to go away. So I'm just going to put it in now. Now we can also use our 1RL tattoo needle. Now this is going to take a little bit longer to get in, because obviously every time you're putting down a mark you are only putting in one line, compared to with our 5M1 we're putting in multiple lines. So that's why I tend to use that bit more for the base layers. But if I want something that's a little bit more wild looking, I'll use something like this just to add a bit of variety. And then judging tones, it's just a little bit darker than what these two areas are here. So again, we're just going to go back in. And we're being really, really delicate here. We're not gouging the board, we're not pushing hard. We just want to gently and slowly build up the brightness. And with Scratchboard, it's a lot easier to brighten something up than it is to darken something back down again. So I'd rather have things look a little bit dull to begin with and then boost up that sort of brightness, then have something that's too bright and then have to use inks and washes to try and darken that back down. I find the washes, unless you sort of mix them with blues and reds, they can have a bit of a warm brown sepia type of tone to them. So I just prefer to try and keep my boards as clean as I can and not have any washes. So I've got an idea of where this then white stripe, it's not a white stripe, it's just an area of fur that's catching a bit more light. But I've got an area of where that is now. Okay, so now that we've got that area in, we're going to just start sort of bringing this fur down slightly onto this side, because after this we're going to start working on the nose and the muzzle. So I want these side aspects in when I'm looking to do that. Now these areas, they are quite faint, they're going to be the darker areas, so we don't want to go too bright. So to give myself a bit more control, I've actually now swapped onto some new tattoo needles, because I found you'll find after a couple of pieces with tattoo needles, they do start to go a bit blunt. And when they start to go a bit blunt, the marks that you make, it gets a bit harder to put them down, and it doesn't glide as smoothly as it should. And you start getting these almost jagged marks, they're not smooth first strokes. So you can make it work if you're doing sort of light fur, but if you want really crisp, sort of darker fur, I'd suggest just using a new tattoo needle. And these marks are really, really subtle. They should be being just about picked up on camera. But that's, like I say, because I've had to adjust the exposure. So you should be able to see them. But on the board they are incredibly light. Now, when we're looking at working an area such as this muzzle is eventually going to start overlapping. As you can see, sort of the fur on the reference photo, it starts overlapping onto these areas. So you do want to try and work up to that line that we've made. And then when this fur starts coming over, it's going to look a lot more realistic. So still need to come up a bit more up here. And like I say, as we get further into this piece, we'll be able to judge these areas a little bit better for their tone, and we'll just be able to adjust things as we go. So this side of the face is in a little bit more shadow. So the same area that's on this side doesn't have quite as much detail. But you can see that there is some, especially on this upper side, there is some fur just catching the light. And that's just what we're going to try and get in. And this goes very much for any animal with sort of these black areas of fur. On a regular panda, on a tiger, on a leopard, their spots, etc., they're actually made of fur. They're not just blank spaces. So do just try and look for those subtle hairs that are just catching the light. Don't be too forceful with your strokes, but just a little bit of an indication to show that there's some fur there can really help boost that realism. Now I'm not going to come too far down on this side because a lot of the whiskers and sort of the muzzle area is going to be coming over into that. But I am just going to adjust these highlights. And again, as we work throughout this piece, as well as adjusting things because other areas are in, you'll also find that you end up blowing some of the dust or moving some of the dust onto other areas of the board, and that will also darken a few areas up. It's good just to go back in and then readjust those highlights. Be careful not to gouge your board like I've just done there. Okay. So these areas are going to start to make a lot more sense once we start getting the areas around them in place. Sometimes it can be a bit scary when you're looking at your piece as it is at this sort of stage, and it doesn't quite look 100% just because you haven't got those surrounding areas in that sort of help make it or help give it that realistic look. Okay, so we're going to start moving on to this muzzle area now. Now I'm going to start with the nose itself before I then work on the fur surrounding it. Now looking at the size of this nose, I'm going to use a couple of different tools. So first of all, I'm going to use my fiberglass brush. Now this is mainly going to be for this area on the top of this nose. And again, feel free if you want to use a cross-hatching technique, but I'm personally going to use a stippling technique. I think I very rarely will use a cross-hatching technique, and I think it's just personal preference. Now again, do just be careful and take your time with an area such as this. So when I'm using my fiberglass brush, if I want it to be quite a soft area and not sort of like a harsh line, I'll keep my actual part of the fiberglass brush out by roughly about an inch or so. Whereas if I wanted to do something a lot more detailed or brighter, I would probably have it about there. So at the minute, I just want to have a bit of, I want to slowly build this up. And all I'm doing is I'm just dabbing it on and taking it off. So I'll do it here so you can see. And taking it off. And it just leaves a very, very faint mark. And as I do it, what I do is I'll rotate so that I don't get like a harsh edge. Or if I want an area, if I do want a harsh edge, like almost like a chiseled edged, I'll use a bit of sandpaper and I'll just sand this down. And I just find it gives a really nice soft stippling texture. Now it works really well, but also it doesn't give you a great deal of control. So you do just have to be careful, especially when you're working around the edges, or such as in the middle here where it's got a bit of a cluster. That can sometimes happen. But when I'm working around the edge, I'll tend to use my tattoo needle, and it will just give me a little bit more control, especially when you want that hard edge, or when you've got like this thin area just catching the light. Now on the original reference photo for this nose, it was very, very dark. So what I ended up doing was just brightening the reference photo slightly, and just sort of brightening the shadows so that I could see a little bit more detail, just because I feel like it'll, by adding in that detail, it will just help give that realism. It will just help me look at the structures a bit more. So you couldn't actually see this almost center groove down the nose, but even though you couldn't see it, I feel like it needs it. And just similar to the eyes, we're just building up that structure, building up that shape, and then we'll look at going in and refining things a little bit more. Now I've got that sort of base layer in, I'm going over again with my tattoo needle. I may change again to my fiberglass brush just to soften a few things out. But I'm just seeing what happens if I put more of a almost scribble texture in and seeing how that looks. So again, sometimes I'll just experiment and see if it gives me the texture or the look that I want, and if not, it doesn't matter, I'll just go over it. Noses like this, they can be particularly tricky, especially when they're in such shadow and there's not an awful lot of detail to work with. You have to really try and make sure your lines aren't too bright. Now, what I'm doing now, I'm actually just going back onto my reference photo. I'm just going to boost up those shadows even more, just so I can see a little bit more detail on where things are. Because even though it's not showing, I feel like it needs bit more detail to really make it stand out. And what I don't want to do is put some details in an area that is sort of slightly off. So his nostrils about there. And then this ridge just along the bottom is just catching the light, so I'm just going to put a few more highlights down here. And then it just comes up and around. Okay, so that's that side in. This area is just in a bit more shadow, so I just need to make sure I don't go as bright as on the other side, and I'll re-establish that sort of central line. Right then guys, so this area just underneath the nose has been a little bit more tricky. So I actually feel like I've now gone a little bit too bright. So what I wanted to do was show you how I would go about darkening that back up. So I've got some India ink. So this is just Bombay black India ink. Now Ampersand do their own India ink, but like I say, I do find that that goes a little bit more of a sepia colour. So what I've ended up doing is I've just mixed it with a little bit of water. And I just want to see, I've dabbed off the excess. And I just want to see whether this is going to darken it down enough or whether I need to add some more ink. Because like I said, I try not to add too much ink into the mixture, because I don't want it to alter the colour. I'm just very, very lightly going over this area. Now this, it will change the colour ever so slightly, and it won't take out obviously the scored marks that are on the board from actually putting in the indents and the scratches, but it will just dull that tone down a bit, which is what we're aiming for. Now you do have to make sure this area is completely dry before you sort of start working back over into it. But I'm not going to be doing too much more work on this area. Now I think I actually need probably to go a touch darker. I'm just going to put another little bit of ink down. Mix that in with my water and then just dab off the excess. And you can just see how, I don't know if it's been picked up on camera as well as in person, but this has really darkened that tone back up. I might just use it just to add a little bit of texture over this area as well. And like I say, this is incredibly subtle. And the idea is just to do this really, really slowly, because if you do end up putting just pure ink onto this part of the board, it will almost look like a shiny patch. So you don't want to really do that. So I can just this slightly so you can get a better idea. It's a balance between getting it dark enough but also still having that texture there. And I think that's probably about where I want it to be. I think if I start adding too much more, it's going to start altering the colour. But that's generally what I do to try and re-establish some of those darks. And what you can also do is, whilst you've got it, you can work into any other areas that you wanted to just go a little bit darker. So for me, just a little bit around the edge of these pupils, just to really soften that out a little bit. But like I said, I'm not going to put in too much. So next area that we're going to tackle is going to be working around this actual muzzle itself. Right then guys, so we've now finished the nose of this red panda. You may have noticed I've just darkened the underneath side of this nose a little bit more. I felt like I went a little bit too bright, so I've just used a little bit of India ink mixed with some water, and then I've just darkened that down slightly. Now this nose isn't completely finished. I feel like I need to get this surrounding fur in before I can make that determination on if we need to go any brighter or not. And that's a little bit of the problem sometimes, is you'll need an area that, like I said with the eyes, you'll need an area that's a bright area, just so that you know how you can judge your tones. Now the nose is a little bit far away from this area, and also the eyes, they're not really big enough to make that clear judgment. But this muzzle is probably one of the brightest areas on this whole piece, so it's one of the areas that we're going to be able to judge a lot of our tones off. So I'm just using my 5M1 tattoo needle just to lay in this base layer of fur, and this is the same like I say as what we used above the eyes as well, just for this initial layer. But again, like I said, I'm just paying very, very close attention to that fur direction and that fur length. Now it is a little bit harder to see on this area which way the fur is going because it is so bright, and I probably won't go as bright as it is in the photo. I'll probably hold back some of those highlights slightly. And I try and start in a few different areas on something like this nose, and what I'll look to do is end up joining all those different areas together. So I've started down here and I've put in the fur direction, I've then moved up here and I've put in this fur direction, and then I'll slowly come round and sort of add it all together. And same for this sort of side down here. The fur, as you get really close into this nose, is going to be incredibly short. So we're just going to put the very lightest little dots of fur texture in there, just like that. The very small, stubbly sort of fur. And then we're looking at the reference photo, we can see as we're in line with this sort of midpoint of the nose, the fur comes straight out to the side, almost horizontally. And then it curves round to this upper area. Now on an area of white fur like this, it's really important to take your time to build up the layers. That's how I tackle any fur that's bright or white. And that's because I want to try and eliminate the dark shadows that are underneath or between the fur. So obviously just up here on this nose there is a little bit of shadow, so that's something that we're going to have to pay attention to, but it is only slight, so most of this blackness of the board will need to be worked away or worked upon. And we're not going to worry about those black whiskers just yet. We're going to come in at the end with one of our Faber-Castell Pit Artist pens, one of these, and we're going to put those in at the very end. And you can see I'm really not being very long with these strokes. They are really sort of short and stubbly marks that I'm making. And that's because we're looking at one of those key elements for fur. You know, we're comparing this length of fur, let's say, to the fur above the eye. This area of fur is a lot longer compared to around the nose. So we need to make sure that we're paying attention to that, because that's what's going to help give form. If you start doing the fur around the nose the same length as what you would do the other areas, it's going to look like it's got really long nose fur, and it's just not really going to look right, because animals don't tend to have really long fur on their nose. It tends to be one of the more shorter, stubbly areas. And I'm leaving this gap, this line, as a bit of a ridge, so that I know I need to work up into this. I don't want to get lost with how high this white fur goes. Again, it's really good to have these little lines in to show me where these marks are going, because without these I'd really have to be judging, okay, if we're coming up to the corner of the eye, it goes this way. As we bend round, I need to change it. Whereas with these marks that I've already put in on that line art, it really does help just give me a path really to follow without having to worry too much. And every time you see me stop, let's say now, I'm looking back at my reference photo. I'm not just assuming I know which way everything goes. I am looking just to make sure. So you can see sort of how we've got this rimmed edge now, and what I'm going to do is start working up and across and down. Now this is going to take a little bit of time just to get this base layer in, so I'm just going to speed up this section, and then you'll see me I'll come back to you when I've completed all this base layer and we're adding those bright highlights on top. Okay, so we've now got that sort of base layer in on this fur, and now it's quite clear to see when we're comparing the different layers that we've achieved. So obviously this is our first initial base layer, and then we've got something with a couple more layers, and then something with even a few more layers on top of that. So you can instantly see the difference in brightness and tone, and that's what we're going to be looking to achieve. So when we're looking, let's say, at our reference photo, this area of brightness is very similar to this area above the eyes. Now it's really up to you if you want to keep it that sort of level of brightness, or if you want to tone it down, or if you just want to hold and not go as bright to begin with. Now there's a couple of ways you can tackle this next layer. So first one is you can use your X-Acto knife, or craft knife and add a layer around. Now that's okay, but we've still got quite a few sort of black areas showing through in between the fur. So I want to show you what would happen if you went around again just with this same tattoo needle, but just press a little bit harder. So it's going to be the same technique, but I'm just pressing probably another 50% on top of what I was originally doing. So instantly you can see that this area here is a lot brighter than the other areas. So you can instantly see that. Now I like doing this type of texture and this technique for certain types of fur. So for example, around this muzzle, where the fur's quite short, it's quite densely compacted, I wouldn't use this for highlights that were sort of specifically, it's hard to word, so let's say for example these highlights that are just on here where I want to see the individual hairs. I wouldn't use this technique because this technique is almost aiming for a denser type brightness. Now you can also use your your RL type of needles. So this is my 9RL, and if I just again press a little bit harder, not as hard because it will leave this type of tattoo needle will leave a brighter mark, but you can see we get a very similar densely packed looking fur. So if it's something that looks a bit more dense, so maybe let's say for example with the ears, the muzzle, but if there's anything that needs a specific hair or specific hair strands to look highlighted on their own, then I would use my craft knife. And this is why this tool is probably one of my favourite ones to use for fur, because it's really versatile and I probably use it the most out of all my tools. So instantly you can really see the stark difference between these two different areas. So we're just going to carry on going around and sort of building this level of brightness up. We're also going to, obviously, as we've already started, putting in a little bit of this chin texture as well. So I'm going to go round, add this area of denser fur in, and then I'll come back to you on the next layers where I'll probably look to be using my craft knife just to refine these textures a little bit. Okay, so we've managed to get most of this base layer in now, and you can see how the tone is getting quite similar to this area up here. It's not quite there yet, but we have started to really get rid of a lot of that unnecessary dark area underneath this area of fur. So this would probably be the time that I would look to come in with my craft knife. And again, I'm just trying to be very, very gentle with this because the pressure that you get used to, the pressure of what you were just doing. So the pressure that I was putting through my hand when I was using the tattoo needles was a lot more than what I'm putting through now. I'm being quite light with this because this will always give me a much brighter mark. And now that we're putting these in, we're actually putting in individual hairs. We're not putting in sort of more than one hair at a time because of the type of blade we're using. Whereas with the tattoo needles, every time I put down a stroke, I was laying down sort of 5 marks at a time. So this type of refinement now just needs to slow down a little bit. And this is where you can accidentally press a bit too hard and go a bit too bright. It can be where you make a line look accidentally a bit too thick. So it's not as forgiving as those under layers. So we do just need to really take our time when we're putting these strokes in, because these are the ones that are going to show. These are the ones that are more detailed on the top surface, that the viewer is going to see more than those sort of base layers. So I'm just slowly really feeling my way into this. I'm not going too fast too quickly, and I'm still just following the fur direction that we've laid down and the fur length. I'm still paying attention as well to my reference photo, because there will be slight changes and tonal shifts in that. So obviously here where these whiskers are going to start coming out, we need to pay attention there. And I would rather build up more layers and have another layer on top of this, because I haven't gone bright enough, than put in a single layer that's too bright. Now if we were just trying to put in these layers straight away with this craft knife, it wouldn't really work. You wouldn't have, as long as, well, that's probably correct it. If let's say you were doing it just with a craft knife, you would have to put in these light base layers first. You wouldn't want to press too hard. If you were to press too hard and try and do this bright fur layer in one layer with the craft knife, it would look very, very wiry. There wouldn't be any depth to it. So you can see here there's an area of fainter fur just rimming this edge, and then this lighter fur here, and it just gives this impression that this muzzle is just curving around and the light's just catching this area that's a little bit more prominent. And we're able to do that because we've got these base layers in and we've got these layers down. We spent the time working on this area. And as we come up here, these strokes are just a little bit more, a little tiny bit more wavy and a little bit longer. Now it's starting to feel like this blade is getting a little bit blunt. I'm just having to work a little bit harder to get the marks that I want. Now it doesn't mean that the blade's useless, we can still use it. It's just it's making me aware that we're going to need to look at changing the blade soon. And it just feels like it wants to catch more, and it just doesn't feel as smooth, it feels a little bit rough when I'm putting these marks down. Now the blades that I use for this, or for my craft knife, I use these Swan Morton blades. Now this is a number 11 and it's got a slightly different tip to traditional craft knife blades. Now I use it a couple of ways. So the first way is I use it like this, where the actual sharp bladed part, this part here, is facing towards the board when I'm doing my marks. And this gives me almost like a medium highlight. If I turn it around and I do it with the blade facing towards me, it gives me a much brighter highlight. So I'll just show you up here. So I'm not going to do too much of that because I don't want to go that bright just yet. But this allows me to almost have two options with this blade. So that's why I tend to use this one quite often. And we're starting now to add in some little details. So we're bringing this bit of fur over and we'll be overlapping this going out to the edge. And it's just going to help start refining a few bits in a few different areas. But like I say, we wouldn't have been able to do this if we hadn't got those base layers in first. So I'm going to carry on now. I'm going to carry around here. I'm going to build up the brightness. I think I'm going to change my blade as well because this is getting, like I say, a little bit blunt on this one side. And then what I'll do is I'll come back to you once we've got all that fur in. Right then, so we've managed to build up the brightness all around this muzzle. I've brought you back just so that we can start working down here. Now this is just his chin, so the technique's going to be the same. But when we're looking, there's an area just here that looks like it's in a bit more shadow. So we're not going to go quite as far as that with these highlights. And we're just pulling them over the background slightly. And then it's going to be the same on this side. Now these aren't the final highlights and they're not the final details. They're going to come in much later. Like I say, I get everything up to about 75–80% complete. So I won't be going around and making those final adjustments until everything's in. Okay, this needs to just come up slightly. Okay. So what we're going to start doing now is joining all of these areas together. So at the minute this looks a bit cut out. There's an area of white fur that needs to go in here, and then we need to join this area from the top down. And then I think once that's done, most of this little face is going to be complete. So then we'll move on to some of the other sections. So I'm just I'm going back to my 5M1 tattoo needle. I'm just pulling everything down, adding in those base layers, and then we'll come up and back over with our highlighted marks. So as I was saying before, I went around here with that second layer with this, which was my tattoo needle, but the area up here needs more defined fur. So I'm not going to put those highlights in with this, I'm going to put them in with my craft knife instead. And they're a little bit more wavy, so trying to capture that. And then there's this area down the middle of almost brighter fur, just probably catching the light. I'm still using that sort of backside edge of this craft knife. I'm not putting in those final highlights yet. So you can see now how it looks like these two areas are a bit more joined together. It's a bit more like one piece. Now this still needs adjusting. This area still isn't quite bright enough. So I may go back on my word about putting in those extra highlights. And I may have to put them in now, just because I think we're still a little bit of a way off where I want us to be. It probably doesn't look as bright on my camera. My camera's probably making it look a little bit brighter than what it is. So this is the other side now of this craft knife. So instantly it's just made a bit of difference there. And then we'll do the same on this side before we forget. Okay. So for this area that's just on this edge, again, I probably don't want to make it as bright as what the part of the face is, because this is part of sort of this area here. Now if I do it the same brightness, or I don't leave a little line or something to separate these two areas, it will all just blend into one. And I kind of want to keep it separated. I might change my mind as we go on, and it might stand out a bit too much, and I might just want to adjust it, and I'll take away that line. But for now, I think I want a little bit of separation between these two areas. And what I'll do is I'll join them in at the bottom. So I think that just gives a little bit more interest, just having that very slight line there. Like I say, I may change my mind as I go on, and I may want to adjust things. So these are some of the now brighter highlights going in. Now I know I said I was going to wait till the end. These still aren't the main highlights that I'm going to do. These are just a couple, just so that I can judge a few other areas coming off this side. And you need to be really light with these layers. like I said, I'm not pressing hard, I'm probably pressing lighter than I've pressed on the entire piece for these layers, because this blade's so sharp it just takes off that ink so easily and leaves such a bright mark. You've got to be so careful you don't overdo it. You can see just how long an area, I mean this is only a couple of inches in size. I think it's probably like 3 inches this way, maybe 2. And it's taken a very long time to get up to this sort of brighter level. And that's probably what takes one of the most times, or sort of the longest time in Scratchboard, is if you have something that's a dense area of white fur. It just takes ages to sort of build things up. I'm not sure if those sort of subtle brightness changes or tonal changes were picked up on camera. I can see them here in the studio, but sometimes the camera will struggle to adjust to that, so hopefully you can tell a bit of difference. Okay, now I think this area here just needs a little bit of adjustment now. So as I said before, as we add new areas in, as we brighten up areas, other areas then just need small adjustments. And this is why I don't complete things until the very end, because you have to judge them the whole piece together. I'm just going to adjust underneath here. A little bit down here. So the last few little touches on this area. And then I think we'll leave it like that for this part. So obviously it's been a little bit of a longer one. So we've done the eyes, we've done the area around the eyes, we've done the nose, and we've done the muzzle. Most of this is going to be probably adjusted throughout this whole piece again, like I say, as we go on. As we get into some other areas, I mean this is probably one of the brighter areas. We've got a bit down on the cheek here, and then obviously the ears, but most of the other areas after that are sort of mid-tones and darks. So now having this area of brightness in, it's really going to help us judge these other areas from that. And it's probably the more complicated part of the piece now, sort of getting that area in. The ears are probably going to be a little bit more complicated as well, but they're not going to be as sort of detailed as what we've had to go on the face. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this one. Hopefully you've picked up a few techniques and tips. In the next one, like I say, we'll start to work out from the other areas and probably look to complete most of the face in part 2. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and I'll see you again in the next one.